Picture this. You have a tiny, resource-poor island nation. It's suddenly thrust into independence, facing sky-high unemployment, severe racial tensions, and a completely, utterly uncertain future. Back in 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was a measly 500 US dollars. Fast forward to 1991, and that number had absolutely skyrocketed to over 14,000 US dollars. They completely transformed a former British colonial trading post into a first world powerhouse. I mean, this wasn't just standard economic growth, it was a borderline improbable economic miracle. Okay, let's dive into this, because you absolutely do not engineer that kind of miraculous turnaround through wishful thinking. You need resolve. Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding prime minister, had this incredibly blunt, steely determination. He fundamentally believed that a strictly ordered society was the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for prosperity. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking the exact cultural and political blueprint that built modern Singapore. We're going to look way beyond just the economic spreadsheets to examine the underlying ideology that drove it all. It's a concept Kuan Yew famously championed as Asian values. All right, here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The miracle of Singapore. 2. Defining Asian values. 3. Philosophy into policy. 4. The price of order. And 5. A lasting legacy. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the miracle of Singapore. Look, to really grasp this philosophy, we first have to understand the heavy historical baggage Singapore faced right at its genesis. It was definitely not a smooth transition to statehood. The People's Action Party, the PAP, was founded in 1954, and that led to self-government in 1959. But the defining, truly existential moment was 1965. After a very brief, highly volatile merger with Malaysia, Singapore was literally forced into independence amid some really deep racial and ideological conflicts. Basically, they were an island with zero natural resources, surrounded by much larger neighbors, and facing immediate threats to their very existence. It was this intense, palpable vulnerability that made strong, decisive leadership feel absolutely necessary, just for pure survival.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining Asian values.
To solve those existential threats, Kuan Yew developed a very specific cultural worldview, and this brilliantly illustrates the core of his ideology. He argued that culture, way more than economics, actually determines a nation's fate. He looked at the West and saw societies treating the individual as atomistic, separate, hyper-focused on unfettered personal rights. In stark contrast, his concept of Asian values championed communitarianism. That means the primacy of group interests over individual interests. It's like a giant puzzle. He believed this total group effort was essential for a developing nation to modernize rapidly without fracturing into a million pieces. This quote from Lee highlights exactly how he viewed the fundamental building blocks of a nation. The individual isn't just isolated on an island, they exist within a deep network. In his view, the family is the core, fundamental unit of society. The family provides the support, the loyalty, and the duty that a government simply cannot, and frankly, shouldn't ever try to replace. So from that family-centric view flowed some very specific core virtues. We're talking thrift, intense hard work, a deep respect for scholarship and learning, discipline, and above all else, social harmony and a long-term orientation. Lee argued these were the exact cultural traits that explained East Asia's rapid modernization. He truly believed these values allowed Singapore to achieve incredible economic growth without experiencing the social breakdown, crime, and loss of community trust that he felt he was observing in Western liberal democracies.
Okay, Section 3, philosophy into policy.
Now, philosophy is just talk until it's actually put into practice, right? And Kuan Yew was fiercely, unapologetically pragmatic. It was all about survival over ideological purity. He actually reversed early anti-colonial stances so he could aggressively attract foreign direct investment. He pragmatically made English the working language to plug into the global economy. They cultivated the Asian dollar market to rival London and New York. And just to ensure that vital social harmony we talked about, the government brokered strict tripartite agreements to guarantee labor peace.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they took that philosophy and literally built it into the city's concrete. The Housing and Development Board, or HDB, undertook massive public construction, eventually housing the vast majority of all citizens. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just about providing shelter. It was active social engineering. The state mandated ethnic integration within these housing blocks. You literally couldn't have a solely Chinese, Malay, or Indian neighborhood. By preventing ethnic enclaves, the government forced the cultivation of a unified, multiracial Singaporean identity. Another massive pillar here was clean governance. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau was given incredibly intense investigative powers. And to just completely remove the temptation of corruption, Lee implemented a policy of paying highly competitive private sector-level salaries to government ministers and civil servants. This enforced a strict meritocracy and made Singapore's reputation for absolute cleanliness a major competitive advantage for foreign investors. If you step back, all of these policies map perfectly back to a traditional Confucian hierarchy. Step 1, it starts with self-cultivation, personal discipline, and education. Step 2, that strengthens the family unit. Step 3, a strong network of families builds a stable, cohesive nation. And Step 4, only a stable nation can contribute meaningfully to world peace. Personal discipline was viewed as the literal foundational step to national survival. Which brings us to Section 4, the price of order. But listen, this rapid journey from third world to first came with some heavy, highly debated trade-offs. Lee Kuan Yew was unapologetic about his interventionist approach. He firmly believed that a well-ordered society is the only thing that actually enables the maximum enjoyment of freedoms. He argued that true freedom cannot exist in a state of anarchy or contention. So if the state needed to intervene heavily in the everyday lives of its citizens to ensure stability, well, it would do so without a second thought. Let's look objectively at the actual tools they used to maintain this order. The Internal Security Act, for instance, allowed for detention without trial for anyone deemed a threat to stability. The government utilized strict media controls and brought defamation suits against political opponents. And even private life wasn't exempt. From the Stop It 2 family planning campaigns to incredibly strict public hygiene laws, they created a beautiful garden city, for sure, but one that was bound by absolute rules. And as you can imagine, the debate around these methods is profound. On one side, critics strongly argue that these policies suppressed pluralism, silenced political dissent, and severely restricted civil liberties, all in the name of order. On the flip side, supporters counter that this firmness was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for a tiny, highly vulnerable state in a volatile region. They point out that this model undeniably delivered what matters most to everyday people: world-class prosperity, high home ownership, and unparalleled public safety. Finally, Section 5, a lasting legacy. Decades later, how do we actually measure the impact of all this? So the crucial point is this: the results are inscribed in the physical reality of modern Singapore. Going from a vulnerable trading post with absolutely no resources to a first-world global hub in a single generation is a massive testament to the fact that determined, pragmatic leadership can overcome severe geographical and historical constraints. The Asian values model delivered a high-trust, incredibly high-performance society. Ultimately, Lee Kuan Yew wasn't really interested in philosophical purity. He was just interested in what actually worked. As he said, it's not how you start, but how you arrive. He consistently matched his policies to the harsh realities of his environment rather than adhering to any rigid ideological dogma, whether that dogma came from the East or the West. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating tension to consider today. Singapore's meteoric rise challenges a lot of our baseline assumptions. As we look at the world right now, it begs a huge question. Does truly effective governance always require adapting to local culture and prioritizing collective order? Or are some individual rights truly universal, regardless of the cost to social harmony? It's a complex debate that Lee Kuan Yew forced the entire world to reckon with, and one that continues to shape our understanding of progress today.
I want you to close your eyes for a second and just place yourself in a really specific, really visceral environment.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So the year is 1965. You're standing in the tropical heat of this colonial trading post in Southeast Asia.
Right.
And the British Empire, which has basically run this place for over a century, they're packing up. They're pulling their military presence out.
Leaving a huge vacuum behind.
Exactly. And you're looking around at a society that is literally teetering on the edge of collapse. I mean, we are talking massive unemployment.
Yeah, and extreme poverty.
Yeah.
Like Open sewers and crowded slums.
Right, and deep, violent racial tensions. Blood had literally been spilled on the streets just months before this.
It was a wildly volatile situation.
It really was. And this is a tiny island. You know, it has essentially zero natural resources. It doesn't even have enough fresh water to sustain its own population.
Which is terrifying. They had to rely entirely on a pipeline from a neighboring country.
Yeah, a neighbor that was highly antagonistic at the time. So by every metric of political science, this place is existentially vulnerable. It was not supposed to survive.
Honestly, it sounds like a worst-case scenario in a macroeconomics textbook.
Right. But now I want you to imagine taking that exact same chaotic, impoverished mudflat and within a single generation engineering it into one of the most futuristic, prosperous, global powerhouses on the planet.
It defies all conventional theories of national development. I
Yeah.
mean, leaping from the third world to the first world in just a few decades.
Bypassing timelines that took Western nations centuries to navigate.
Exactly.
And the numbers are just staggering. Like in 1965, this island's GDP per capita was hovering around 500 US dollars.
Wow.
Yeah. But by 1991, that number exploded to over $14,000.
That is a massive jump.
It's unbelievable. And in the decades following, it surged past many Western nations, setting all these global benchmarks. We are talking, of course, about Singapore.
The ultimate Asian tiger miracle.
Right. And you really can't discuss this miracle without looking at the architect who drew the blueprints.
Yeah, Kuan Yew, globally known just by his initials, LKY.
Right. So today's deep dive is an exploration into his specific strategy. We're going to unpack the LKY blueprint for Singapore.
And it's such a unique mix, right? Brilliant economic pragmatism combined with, honestly, microscopic social engineering.
Yeah, and some really heavy societal trade-offs. To kind of frame this for you, think of his task like being handed the keys to a completely bankrupt startup.
With zero capital.
Zero capital. Your employees are deeply fractured, constantly at each other's throats, and your little startup is surrounded by massive, hostile conglomerates who want you to fail.
Right, and your job is to turn it into a Fortune 500 company.
Exactly. But the caveat is, to pull it off, you decide you have to completely rewrite the corporate culture from the ground up, enforcing this unwavering, tight control over the personal lives of every single employee.
That startup analogy is so spot on. He basically viewed the state as a corporation that needed absolute discipline to avoid going under.
Yeah, he was building the economic engine and the social machinery at the exact same time. But before we start dissecting these policies, we really need to establish a clear boundary for you, the listener.
Yes, this is crucial.
Because the source material we're pulling from today touches on some highly charged concepts. We're going to be exploring the intense friction between authoritarian governance, heavy state control, and Western liberal democracy.
Right, and we need to be clear that the goal of this deep dive is absolutely not to take a side in that debate.
Exactly. We're not here to endorse authoritarianism, and we aren't validating any specific left-wing or right-wing ideology either. Our mission is purely analytical.
We just want to impartially unpack the ideas and the historical realities from our sources.
Right. What happened, how it was executed, and why they believe these extreme measures were the only path forward.
Because context is everything here. To analyze the extreme medicine that LKY prescribed, you first have to really diagnose the disease.
Yeah, you can't judge the methods without understanding the absolute terror of the situation back in 1965.
Exactly. So let's lay that groundwork. Let's look at the years leading up to that.
Right. The sources point to the People's Action Party, the PAP, which LKY co-founded in 1954.
Yes, and he leads Singapore to self-government under the British by 1959.
But the real inflection point is this brief, totally disastrous merger with Malaysia in 1963. So walk us through that. Why did they merge in the first place?
Well, the rationale was just sheer survival. LKY and his advisors firmly believed an independent Singapore was an economic and geopolitical impossibility.
Because it was just too small, right?
Right. No domestic market, no hinterland for natural resources or agriculture. So merging with Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak to form Malaysia seemed like the only logical path.
To get that common market.
Exactly. And to have a unified defense against the rising communist threat in the region at the time.
Okay, the logic makes sense. Attach your tiny port to a resource-rich mainland. But this union lasts less than 2 years. The sources say it wasn't a mutual uncoupling, but a traumatic expulsion. What actually happened?
It broke down because of irreconcilable ideological and racial friction.
Really? Like what?
Well, the central government in Kuala Lumpur operated on this framework of Ketuanan Melayu, which means Malo primacy. It gave special privileges to the indigenous Malay population.
Okay. And LKY disagreed with that.
Strongly. LKY and the PP represented a Chinese-majority Singapore. So they forcefully campaigned for a Malaysia, a system based on strict equality for everyone, regardless of race.
Which I imagine did not go over well in Kuala Lumpur.
Not at all. It was a direct challenge to the political status quo, and it created immense hostility.
And this wasn't just, polite disagreements in Parliament. This bled right into the streets.
It resulted in severe violence. The absolute worst were the 1964 race riots in Singapore.
Oh, wow. What sparked those?
They happened during a procession for the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. Clashes broke out between Malay and Chinese groups, leading to dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries.
That's horrifying.
The atmosphere was incredibly volatile, just poisoned by mutual suspicion. It got so bad that the Malaysian leader, Tunku Abdul Rahman, decided the only way to save Malaysia was to amputate the problem.
Meaning Singapore.
Yes. He pushed a bill through to basically expel Singapore from the Union.
Which leads us to August 9th, 1965. And there's that famous footage of LKY announcing the separation, right?
Yeah, he's literally in tears at the press conference.
He calls it a moment of anguish because all his life he believed in the unity of the two territories. It's wild because usually nations celebrate independence as a triumph.
Right, but for Singapore, it was a terrifying eviction.
So what was the immediate psychological impact of that?
It shaped everything. Suddenly, the nightmare scenario was real. A sovereign island completely cut off. And the threats were external and internal.
External meaning the neighbors.
Yeah, surrounded by much larger, potentially hostile neighbors during the Cold War, like the confrontasi with Indonesia was happening.
Right, and internally?
Internally, the society was this fractured mosaic of Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other communities who would just live through deadly ethnic violence.
So if you're LKY in that moment, how do you even start? You have no shared history, no national mythos to fall back on. Just frighten people on a rock.
The answer was just absolute, unyielding pragmatism. Theories were useless if they didn't survive the decade.
So what was step one? Physical security.
Exactly. Especially because the British announced they were pulling their military bases out faster than expected.
Which hurts the economy too, right? Because of all the jobs tied to those bases.
Huge economic blow. So Singapore needed its own armed forces immediately. But you can't just order an army out of a catalog.
No, especially when your neighbors already don't trust you. So where do you get the expertise to build a military from scratch?
Well, you look for someone who survived a similar predicament. LKY secretly reached out to Israel.
Really? Israel?
Yeah. Another small, newly independent nation surrounded by larger, hostile neighbors. The geopolitical parallels were obvious.
But bringing in Israeli military advisors had to be super sensitive, right? Since Singapore is surrounded by Muslim-majority nations sympathetic to Palestine.
It was a diplomatic minefield. So, to manage the optics, they actually discreetly referred to the Israeli advisors as Mexicans while they were building up the Singapore armed forces.
Wait, Mexicans? That is wild. It just highlights the raw calculation. They needed the best blueprint, optics be damned, but they hit it just enough to avoid triggering a war.
Exactly. And the core mechanism of this new military was mandatory conscription, introduced in 1967.
National service, right?
Yes. Every able-bodied male citizen, regardless of race or class, had to serve. But it wasn't just about defense. It was a massive tool for social engineering.
Oh, I see where this is going. You take a young Chinese man, a Malay man, an Indian man, put them in the same barracks, force them through brutal training.
You forcibly manufacture a shared experience.
It's like a crucible.
Right. National service was the great equalizer. It forced fractured communities to rely on each other, breaking down those silos that fueled the '64 riots.
And that ties into the internal shield LKY built, forging a new Singaporean identity based on multiracialism and meritocracy. Let's break those down.
So multiracialism wasn't just a feel-good slogan. It was a rigidly enforced legal framework. The state made it explicitly clear that no single race would hold primacy.
A total 180 from the policies in Malaysia.
Exactly. And meritocracy was the flip side. Advancement was based strictly on ability and output, not your ethnic background or lineage.
The message was basically, work hard and the state will use your talents for national survival.
Yes, but LKY didn't just passively hope this would organically blossom. He engineered it at the street level.
Oh, you're talking about the public housing policies. The sources really focus on this. It seems like one of the most aggressive pieces of social engineering in history.
It really was.
Yeah.
In the 60s, a huge portion of the population lived in squatter settlements and ethnic enclaves.
Which are dangerous because they breed tribalism, right?
Exactly, flashpoints for violence. So the government moved to shatter these enclaves through the Housing and Development Board, or the HDB, which was set up in 1960.
So they start building these high-rises, but how do you stop a new high-rise from just becoming a vertical version of the old ethnic ghetto?
By using what they call the Ethnic Integration Policy, or EIP, they mandated strict ethnic quotas for every single apartment block and neighborhood.
Wow. So if the nation is, what, roughly 75% Chinese, 15% Malay, and 7% Indian?
Your specific apartment building had to reflect those exact percentages.
That is insane. And it wasn't just an initial assignment, right? What about when you want to sell your apartment?
The quotas were enforced upon resale, too. If the Chinese quota in a block was full, a Chinese owner legally couldn't sell their flat to another Chinese buyer. They had to sell to a minority buyer.
That is a staggering level of state intervention. The
Yeah.
government is literally dictating who you can sell your private property to.
It definitely created real economic friction.
I bet. But the structural result is that you force these different groups to share elevators, shop at the same markets, send kids to the same schools. You physically engineer a shared reality.
Because LKY believed if people self-segregated, tribalism would destroy the nation. Survival justified the infringement on personal liberty.
So the borders are secured by conscription, internal cohesion is forced by integrated housing, but concrete apartments don't generate wealth.
No, they don't.
So how did they build the economic engine? The sources say they didn't just let the free market do its thing. It was this meticulously planned, state-directed capitalism.
State-directed is the perfect phrase. While a lot of the decolonized world in the 60s was suspicious of foreign capital, viewing it as, imperialism, LKY took a wildly pragmatic approach.
Because they had no domestic market to rely on anyway.
Right. They couldn't do import substitution. They had to plug directly into the global economy. They needed foreign money fast.
So what were the specific levers they pulled to make that leap from a third world port to a first world industrial hub?
The tip of the spear was the Economic Development Board, the EDB, established in 1961.
Okay, what did the EDB do?
They were designed as a one-stop shop for multinational corporations. Instead of navigating endless red tape, a foreign CEO dealt directly with the EDB.
Ah, making it easy for them.
Exactly. The EDB could offer massive tax incentives, guarantee infrastructure, and promise absolute labor stability.
Let's talk about the physical manifestation of that. The Jurong Industrial Estate. From what I read, this wasn't just renovating some old warehouses.
Not at all. Jurong was essentially a massive swampland in the west of the island.
A swamp.
Yeah. The government poured immense resources into dredging it, leveling hills, building deep water ports and factories. It was a massive financial gamble.
So risky.
Critics actually called it Go's folly, referring to Go King Sui, the finance minister. But it paid off.
They attracted low-skill manufacturing first, right? Like textiles and toys.
Yes, to solve the massive unemployment crisis. Then once they hit full employment, they rapidly shifted to high-tech manufacturing electronics, precision engineering.
And to make sure all these American and Japanese corporations could actually function there, LKY made a deeply controversial linguistic decision.
He made English the primary working language of business and government.
Which is huge because Singapore is fundamentally an Asian society with roots in Chinese, Malay, and Indian cultures.
Exactly. By elevating the language of their former colonial masters, he achieved two crucial goals. First, a neutral bridge language that didn't elevate one native tongue over the others.
Preserving that multiracial balance.
Right. And second, purely economic. It made the workforce instantly accessible to Western multinationals.
Yeah, an American tech company can set up shop and know the engineers and the bureaucrats all speak English. It plugs them right into the global bloodstream.
While their neighbors couldn't match that.
So manufacturing is one massive pillar, but the sources also emphasize finance. The transformation into a global financial hub. They mention the Asian dollar market.
Well,
What exactly is that?
the Asian dollar market is basically a pool of U.S. dollars deposited in banks outside the U.S., specifically in Asia.
Okay.
In the late 60s, there was this growing pool of dollars in Asia, largely from American military spending during the Vietnam War.
I mean, that makes sense.
But these funds typically just flowed back to London or New York because there's no regional financial center in Asia equipped to handle them.
So how did Singapore convince these international banks to park their billions on a tiny island?
They spotted an inefficiency and acted on it. A banker at Bank of America noticed a time zone advantage.
Oh, like what?
Singapore's working hours perfectly bridged the gap between the close of the markets in San Francisco and the opening of the markets in London.
Wow, that is incredibly fortunate geography. But they had to incentivize it, right?
Yes. In 1968, the government abolished the 20% withholding tax on interest earned by non-residents on foreign currency deposits.
That's a massive legislative lever. By killing that tax, it suddenly becomes highly profitable for banks to route their dollars through Singapore.
It catalyzed the entire sector. And then when the global system shifted violently in 1971 with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system.
Meaning the U.S. dollar was no longer pegged to gold, right?
Exactly. Currencies started to float and foreign exchange trading exploded. Because Singapore already laid the groundwork and had that time zone bridge, they were perfectly positioned to rival Zurich and London.
Okay, so we have this incredible macroeconomic machinery. Factories in Jerome, massive dollar transactions in the business district. But let's look at the microeconomic level.
The average citizen.
Right. How do you make sure the working class actually benefits? Because in a lot of developing nations, massive foreign investment just creates a hyper-wealthy elite while the working class stays poor.
Which leads to volatility.
Exactly. So how did LKY ensure the population stayed compliant and invested in this growth?
The solution was this highly sophisticated wealth-building mechanism, the Central Provident Fund, or CPF, working in tandem with the public housing built by the HDB.
The sources describe the CPF as a mandatory savings scheme. How did the math actually work for a regular person?
It was enforced savings on a huge scale. Both the employee and the employer were legally required to contribute a percentage of the monthly salary into a personal CPF account.
And how much is that percentage?
At various points, the combined rate was staggering, sometimes reaching up to 40 or 50% of a worker's gross wage.
Wait, 50%? That sounds politically suicidal. If a government suddenly says, we're taking half your paycheck, you'd expect riots. How did that stabilize anything?
Because the money didn't disappear into a general tax black hole. It belonged to the citizen, but it was restricted. Crucially, the government allowed people to use their CPF savings to buy those subsidized HDB apartments.
Oh, wow. That is a masterclass in structural engineering.
It really is.
So by forcing these massive savings, the state gets this enormous pool of capital to fund infrastructure and housing projects. And because they're locking up liquidity, they curb inflation.
Yes. And the sociopolitical result is arguably the best part. By tying CPF to housing, they turned a population of squatters into a nation of homeowners.
Right. If you use your CPF to buy a 99-year lease on an apartment the government built, you literally have a physical stake in the country.
You have skin in the game.
Exactly. If your life savings are tied up in the equity of that block, you are incredibly unlikely to support a communist revolution or riot in the streets. Your wealth is linked to the state's success.
It fostered an immense degree of social cohesion. The housing and CPF basically bought the political stability that foreign investors demanded.
Okay, but let's address a major vulnerability here. You've got massive state intervention, billions of foreign capital flowing in, huge infrastructure projects. In a lot of countries, that is a recipe for catastrophic corruption.
Absolutely.
Yet the sources say Singapore consistently ranks alongside Scandinavian countries as the least corrupt on Earth. How did LKY engineer a clean system out of a chaotic region?
He institutionalized a policy of zero tolerance, driven by the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, the CPIB.
What kind of power did they have?
Draconian, almost terrifying powers. They could arrest suspects without warrants, freeze assets, deeply probe the finances of officials, their spouses, their extended families.
And crucially, the legal framework shifted the burden of proof, didn't it?
Yes, this was vital. Under their law, if a civil servant is living a lifestyle significantly beyond their official salary or has unexplained wealth.
But the law presumes it was obtained corruptly unless the accused can prove otherwise.
Exactly. They weaponized the legal system against graft. But it wasn't solely about punishment. There was an equally massive proactive measure to prevent temptation.
The salaries, right? highly competitive corporate peg salaries for government ministers, which is fascinating to me. Paying a minister over $1 million a year seems totally antithetical to the whole concept of public service.
It does to a lot of people.
But structurally, it's like buying ultra-premium insurance. It's expensive up front to pay them like multinational CEOs, but it prevents the massive systemic leaks of corruption later on.
That's the logic. If your legitimate state-provided income is already world-class, the temptation to take a $50,000 kickback vanishes.
The risk-to-reward ratio is destroyed. Losing that salary, your pension, and facing the wrath of the CPI, not worth it.
And ensure the government could attract and retain the absolute best intellectual talent that normally goes to the private sector.
You get what you pay for.
AKY literally operated on that philosophy. If you pay peanuts, you get monkeys.
Hmm?
He wanted brilliant, uncorrupted technocrats, and he paid market rates. He famously said, "It's not how you start, but how you arrive."
Raw, unapologetic pragmatism. He don't care if it offended traditional democratic sensibilities as long as it produced hyper-efficient government.
And that approach extended to the workforce, too. You remember how the EDB promised foreign investors labor stability?
Yeah. But in the 60s, labor movements were notoriously militant. Massive strikes paralyzing economies all the time. How did they neutralize that?
Through a tripartite model, heavily managed by the government. The state co-opted the labor movement by creating the National Trades Union Congress, or NTUC.
Which was deeply intertwined with the ruling PAP. So how does tripartism function in reality?
It mandates that the government, the unions, and the employers sit at the same table to resolve disputes and set wages.
Sounds peaceful, but how did they enforce it?
By enacting strict labor laws that made it incredibly difficult to hold legal strikes and completely outlawing sympathy strikes.
So the deal was basically unions surrender the weapon of the strike, and in exchange, the government guarantees annual wage increases and a rising standard of living.
Yes, it turned the union from a militant adversary into a cooperative partner.
Okay, so let's pull back and look at the engine they've built. The swamps are now high-tech factories. Banks are clearing billions. Citizens are housed, savings locked in the CPF. Ministers are highly paid and monitored. No strikes.
It's an incredibly finely tuned machine.
But an engine running at those high RPMs requires absolute, undisturbed stability. And that requirement brings us directly to the dark side of the Singaporean miracle.
Right. The profound trade-offs regarding civil liberties.
The sources are clear that this utopia was built on a foundation of intense political and social control. Critics use terms like illiberal democracy or nanny state. What were the actual mechanical tools used to maintain the PPAP's absolute dominance?
Well, the bluntest instrument in their legal arsenal was the Internal Security Act, the ISA.
What does that do?
It's actually a holdover from the British colonial era.
Right.
The ISA allows the executive branch to arrest and detain individuals without trial, without charges for renewable periods, if they're deemed a national security threat.
Detention without trial. That is the ultimate authoritarian lever, bypassing the entire judicial process. How did LKY use it?
Aggressively in the early years.
Yeah.
Like during Operation Cold Store in 1963, to decapitate the leftist opposition. Over 100 activists and politicians were detained.
They argued it was necessary to prevent a communist takeover, right?
Yes, but human rights groups point out the ISA remained in place long after the communist threat evaporated. It was periodically used to intimidate journalists and opponents, creating this pervasive climate of fear.
And for opponents who weren't detained, they had another strategy, the aggressive use of civil defamation suits.
Yes. Rather than jailing political rivals, which creates martyrs and international condemnation, they sued them personally for defamation in the civil courts.
If an opponent made an allegation of, say, nepotism or financial impropriety,
the PTA leaders would sue them for everything they had. And the Singaporean courts consistently ruled in favor of the leadership, awarding massive financial damages.
Damages so large they would bankrupt the opposition politicians.
Exactly, like J.B. Jarrett Nam or Chizoon Wan. And under Singaporean law, if you're an undischarged bankrupt, you are legally disqualified from running for parliament.
That is a chillingly elegant way to dismantle an opposition. You use lawyers and the civil code instead of secret police. Alongside this, they had strict media controls, like the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act.
Right. The media was never designed to be an independent watchdog there. The state's stance was that the media must assist in nation building.
The government could literally revoke publishing licenses.
Yes, and if foreign publications like Time or Newsweek published articles deemed interfering, the government could drastically restrict their circulation numbers in Singapore.
Which kills their ad revenue. It's a very comprehensive system of control. But what really fascinates me and earns that Nanny State moniker is how this control filtered down to the most mundane aspects of daily life. Let's look at population control.
The demographic policies are a stark example. In the late 60s, they feared rapid population growth would overwhelm the infrastructure, so they launched the Stop at 2 campaign.
But it wasn't just a billboard asking nicely. What were the actual disincentives?
They were deeply structural. If you had a third or fourth child, delivery fees at government hospitals scaled up drastically.
Wow.
And subsequent children lost priority registration for the best schools. Large families were even deprioritized for public housing. The state made it economically punishing.
But then, when this worked a little too well, and birth rates among the highly educated plummeted, they completely reversed course in the 80s. The sources explicitly link this new policy to eugenics.
Yes, the Graduate Mother Scheme in 1984.
What was the rationale there?
LKY was deeply concerned that educated women were having fewer children than uneducated women. Drawing on controversial genetic theories, he believed this would lower the national intelligence over time.
So what did they do?
They offered massive tax reliefs and school admission priorities to mothers with university degrees who had multiple children.
And for the uneducated mothers?
Conversely, they offered financial grants to low-income, uneducated mothers on the strict condition that they agree to undergo sterilization.
That is a staggering level of state interference in the fundamental human right to form a family. It's wild. And the micromanagement extended to public behavior, too, to maintain the Garden City vision.
The micro-laws. Heavy financial penalties for littering, for spitting, for failing to flush a public toilet.
And the chewing gum ban.
Yes, famously. They banned the importation and sale of chewing gum because discarded gum was interfering with the door sensors on their multi-billion-dollar mass transit system.
Okay, this is where I really have to step in and push back on the narrative. I understand the ISA in the 60s when communist bombs were a real threat. I understand macroeconomic control. But micromanaging family sizes, eugenics, toilet flushing police.
It sounds absurd to Western ears.
Was this truly essential for national survival? Or was this just a government addicted to absolute control? I found a quote from LKY himself from 1956, before he had absolute power. He said, "Repression, sir, is a habit that grows. I am told it is like making love. It is always easier the second time."
That's a powerful quote.
Did he fall victim to his own warning?
Well, that is the central paradox of his legacy. Critics unequivocally argue, yes, the PIP fell into the habit of repression, expanding state control far beyond what was necessary.
Creating a suppressed, sterile society.
Exactly, sacrificing civil liberties at the altar of efficiency. But to understand the system fully, you have to look at their defense. They reject the premise that these are trivial overreaches.
How do you justify the chewing gum in the toilets?
Through the lens of systemic discipline. LKY argued Singapore was an artificial construct in a hostile environment. He applied a sort of broken windows theory to the entire country.
Meaning if you let petty indiscipline fester.
It signals a breakdown in societal order. Their entire economic survival relied on projecting pristine stability to jittery foreign investors. Disorder wasn't just aesthetic, it was an economic threat. The strict laws were designed to forcibly upgrade the civic habits of a rapidly urbanizing population. The social contract was, we restrict your freedoms and police your behavior, but we guarantee your physical safety and unprecedented economic ascendance.
And as our wealth skyrocketed in the 80s and 90s, Western critics really targeted this authoritarian structure because the Western assumption is that as a country gets rich, it naturally democratizes.
But Singapore didn't.
Right? And LKY didn't offer apologies. The sources highlight he went on a massive intellectual offensive. He formulated a comprehensive philosophy to justify his model to the world.
Yes, the Asian values philosophy. It gained massive global traction in the post-Cold War era.
The text points to a 1994 interview he did with Fareed Zakaria in Foreign Affairs called "Culture is Destiny." What are the foundational mechanics of this argument?
Basically, he argued that culture, the deep cultural software of a society, determined its destiny far more than economic systems. He drew a sharp contrast between East Asian societies influenced by Confucianism and Western societies.
What did he see as the core difference?
The placement of the individual. In the West, the individual is the primary unit, with inalienable rights that trump societal demands. In Asian values, the individual only exists within a hierarchy. Family first, then community, then nation.
Intense communitarianism.
Yes, primacy of collective interests over individual rights. He argued that rapid national development requires a total, coordinated group effort. Discipline, respect for authority, and delaying personal gratification for the society's benefit.
And he used this to launch a blistering critique of the West, specifically America, right?
Relentless. He blamed excessive Western individualism for creating massive social ills, epidemic drug use, violent crime, the breakdown of the family unit, and hyper-partisan politics.
He famously said he wasn't convinced that one man, one vote was the best system for all societies.
He argued a well-ordered society, even if illiberal, provides the maximum amount of real freedom, the freedom to walk safely at night. Freedom can't exist in contention and anarchy.
But we have to critically dissect this because it feels incredibly convenient. Is Asian values a genuine reflection of ancient Confucian wisdom, or just a really articulate post hoc excuse to suppress democracy and keep power?
That exact skepticism forms the core of the academic pushback in the sources. Scholars like Michael D. Barr argue that while LKY was consistent in his elitism, the Asian values justification was full of hypocrisies.
Like what? What's the biggest contradiction?
The family unit. LKY claimed the sacred traditional family was the core of Asian values. Yet, as Barr points out, the state relentlessly interfered with it whenever it suited their economic goals.
Right. The eugenics policies, the sterilization campaigns.
Dictating how many children a family should have based on education. Pushing mothers into the workforce to boost labor, relying on foreign domestic workers to fill the gap. They were engineering the family for output, not protecting it.
Totally treating it as an economic variable. The sources also mention Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate. How did he attack it?
Sen attacked the historical essentialism. He pointed out the absurdity of treating all of Asia, this vast continent of Confucian, Islamic, Hindu, and Buddhist traditions, as a uniformly collectivist monolith.
Yeah, Asia's huge.
Right. Sen argued that democratic ideals, tolerance, and individual freedoms have deep Asian roots too, citing ancient figures like Emperor Ashoka. Democracy isn't exclusively a Western import.
Basically saying, don't flatten thousands of years of history to justify your 20th century authoritarianism. And there was pushback from within Asia, too, from leaders like Kim Dae-jung.
The former president of South Korea, who survived authoritarian repression himself. He challenged LKY directly in foreign affairs, arguing Asian values was a myth concocted as an authoritarian cover.
And beyond academia, history itself delivered a blow with the 1997 Asian financial crisis.
Yes, that was the reality check.
Wow.
Before 97, regional leaders used Asian values to claim their lack of democracy was their economic superpower.
But the crisis exposed the weaknesses.
The crony capitalism, nepotism, weak regulations in places like Indonesia and Thailand. It showed their previous success was more about pragmatic macroeconomics and Cold War geopolitics than some mystical cultural values.
To really synthesize all of this, how the nation was built, the economic engines, the rigid philosophies, we have to look directly into the psychology of the architect.
Through his own words.
Yes, the sources provide several direct quotes from LKY, and it is a jarring experience to read them. Modern politicians are so PR managed, but LKY's words are shockingly blunt.
His psychology was forged in iron and absolute pragmatism. He only cared about effectiveness.
Let's look at one. On governance, he said. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I've spent a whole lifetime building this, and as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down.
That perfectly captures that existential terror from the beginning. Politics was a matter of life and death for him.
And regarding the electorate, he said, I ignore polling as a method of government. I think that shows a certain weakness of mind and inability to chart a course whichever way the wind blows.
He viewed leadership as paternalistic. You calculate the correct destination and forcefully steer the ship there. You don't pull the passengers.
He explicitly defended the nanny state. I am often accused of interfering in the private lives of citizens. Yes, if I did not, we wouldn't be here today. We decide what is right. Never mind what the people think.
Never mind what the people think. That's the ultimate distillation of his governing philosophy.
And then echoing Machiavelli. Between being loved and being feared, I have always believed it is better to be feared and respected.
It's just incredible to hear a leader say that out loud.
Right. If a politician anywhere else said, never mind what you think, it's better you fear me, there would be riots. How did he survive saying that and foster deep public trust?
Because the bluntness was tethered to undeniable world-leading competence. Political scientists call it performance legitimacy. He didn't just talk tough, he delivered the goods.
So when the government says, do not question us, but then delivers physical safety, home ownership, world-class education, and immense wealth in a single generation.
The populace forgives the arrogance. The bluntness was perceived as raw authenticity. The social contract was brutally clear, and he delivered on his end.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, LKY's legacy really emerges as the ultimate case study in the mechanics of trade-offs.
Absolutely.
He proved that fiercely determined, pragmatic leadership could conquer severe vulnerabilities and deep trauma. He took a bankrupt society and built a global powerhouse.
But the crucial takeaway is that the miracle wasn't free. It required a controversial, often painful sacrificing of individual liberties for collective prosperity.
It fundamentally challenges the Western assumption that liberal democracy is the only viable path to flourishing.
It really does.
Which leaves us with a final fascinating question from the sources. Singapore is evolving in this post-LKY era. Younger generations who grew up in wealth and safety are starting to want liberalization. They want more diverse voices, less control.
Which is a very natural evolution for a highly educated, connected society.
Right. But consider the paradox. Will the very success of LKY's system, the fact that he engineered this highly educated, wealthy middle class, inevitably serve to dismantle the rigid, authoritarian structure he built to achieve it?
Can a society engineered for desperate survival maintain its iron discipline once it achieves comfortable luxury?
Exactly. It's a profound question of whether the cure eventually outgrows the need for the extreme medicine. Just something for you to mull over as you navigate your own understanding of how nations are built.